Hey, everybody. So, today in Race in the US and last week in Salt Lake, both times we had the conversation around white privilege. Now, that word tends to trigger some emotions and some thoughts and some feelings in different people and different groups. There's a lot of different perspectives out there about privilege. But I think it's a concept that oftentimes is really misunderstood. I think that people they look at it as if privileged versus having privilege, right? Like if you say that I have white privilege, then you're saying that I live a privileged life, and I don't live a privileged life. I, you know, I have struggled. I grew up in poverty. I've been unemployed. I've been homeless. I've, whatever it may be, like fill in the gap there. And so people have a really hard time talking about privilege, which to me, I don't understand why that is there so much when we talk about white privilege, because people have used the phrase my entire life, like you're so privileged to live in the United States. So we acknowledge that there's privilege of being born in the United States compared to being born in other places, as far as access and to education and health and technology and opportunity and things like that. And so people don't really struggle with that concept when people use that phrase. But when you put it in the context of race and you talk about white privilege, all of a sudden people lose their minds over it. So I always, Pacific Education Group, as they did different trainings in our district, talked about the idea of right-handed privilege, and so I use that now to have conversations with people to introduce them to the concept of privilege, that that there are things in our society, it's designed for right-handed people. It is designed, when you go to drive a car, the stick shift, the desk at schools, you have like the armrest on the right side where your arm goes as you're writing. Even a binder, when you write on a binder, it's more comfortable if you're right-handed than left-handed, where your hand's resting on, the three rings. And then all the way through, computer mouses usually are designed to go on the right side and are set up that way at computer stations. When you think about tools and power tools and chainsaws and like those things, like that can cost you your life, and they're designed for right-handed, and so that's why left-handed people are more prone to accidents. And so we kind of talk about that, and then we talk about the idea that like nobody chose to necessarily be right-handed or left-handed. Some people do end up like kind of forcing ambidexterity, and they kind of force themselves to take on right-handedness. And back in the day, some people were forced to learn how to write with their right hand. But all in all, it's like something that's not really a choice that we have. It favors the majority in our society, and we don't really like feel bad about being right-handed. But when you talk about white privilege, people feel, it's like, you're making me feel bad about it, and making you feel like I didn't work hard for what I have. And that's not what privilege is talking about. That's not what white privilege is talking about. When we use the phrase privilege, it's about unearned advantage. Unearned advantage. And that doesn't mean that you are the most advantaged. It just means that you have some advantage over another person because of your race. And there's plenty of evidence that supports that white privilege exists. A lot of times people just like try to make a blanket statement, oh, white privilege doesn't exist. And they kind of make a claim like, well, like we had a black president, and so that means that anybody can achieve the highest level. And it's like, just not that simple. Yes, anybody can achieve at the highest level, but the road to get there, the path to get there, does have more obstacles if you are a person of color, and you face more backlash and things like that. And so it was really great to get into the conversation with the students around privilege and to hear what their thoughts were and where they're at. We did do the privilege color line, where you kind of take a quiz and see how often things apply to you, and then you line up based on the number that you get at the end. And it was as it's predictable that it goes from kind of a gradient from white students to students of color, and I don't feel like anybody in the room felt like, yeah, there's feelings of shame, there's feelings of like guilt that I think people experience when they see that they have this privilege, and that others in the room don't, and they can't go through school and ever see a teacher of color, can't go into a classroom and sit with people who look like them, can't go to the store without being followed by the police, can't do something wrong without it being attributed to the character of their race. All these different things that kind of come up in our society. Like people feel guilty, but we talked about like not welling in those feelings. It's not about white guilt. It's not about feeling guilty. You can't control. You didn't establish these systems. It's about how do you acknowledge that, and how do you use that to amplify voices of color and to draw attention to racial disparities in the systems that you encounter. So, I know privilege is always a tough one, and it people get shut down right away when they start talking about it. But I think, to me personally, I believe the evidence isn't completely conclusive that white privilege exists in our nation, just like male privilege exists, just like straight privilege exists, just like Christian privilege exists. And we need to just have the conversations about how do we make sure that power is not distributed amongst those lines of privilege, but is shared equitably amongst all peoples. So anyway, deep conversation and hard conversations, but they're worth having, and I'm excited for the future because youth are far better at having these conversations than adults are. They tend to be more empathetic and more understanding of their peers' stories than the adults that I've seen, especially online, but even in a school setting. So, all right, we'll see you tomorrow.